Martin Mills and Gabriel Laffite, who will be speaking to us, educating us about issues that are related to climate change in the context of Tibet, its viewpoints and realities. What will happen is, after our friend Ngodup from the Office of Tibet will give us a welcome remark, Dr. Martin will speak to us for 15 to 20 minutes. After he finishes, Gabriel will also speak to us for 15 to 20 minutes. I'm going to prompt the both speakers. After I prompt them with a few questions, one or two, then we are going to open the floor for questioning from our participants. Meanwhile, it's always our tradition that our speakers introduce themselves as a way of helping us to connect with them, because sometimes when a speaker is introduced, when they start speaking, I speak on my own experience, it's often difficult for them to have that connection with the participants or with the audience. So by them speaking to us, telling us about them, the things they do, then it helps us to flow and then get connected with them. Without much ado, please, Ngodup, the representative of the Office of Tibet in South Africa, please give us an opening remark. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this opening remark. I would like to welcome all the participants and both the eminent speakers to this webinar on behalf of Office of Tibet and Tibet Rescue Initiative and all the other Tibet support group based in South Africa. And the purpose of really organizing this webinar is already in COP27 is taking place in Egypt. And the climate change, the global climate change is not is an issue that the whole global is a collective effort. Only through that we can tackle it, because climate change is an existential threat to the humanity at this point. And if we go as business as usual, I think we are really, a point is reaching very soon of point of no return. And therefore, we cannot say that this is the the concept of inviolability of the sovereignty also applies to the climate change. We cannot apply this concept to the tackling the global climate change, because climate change in one place affects the whole global area. And therefore, so it's important that the Tibet's climate change is also discussed very threadbare, because Tibet, it has got a unique ecosystem. It's a very high, arid, surrounded by mountains, and it's a very, very big. You can say, if you calculate include all the Tibet Plateau as well as Hindu Kush region, it is about more than 3 million square meters. And it has effect on creating the weather pattern in India and South China. I was wondering, why there is so much humanity densely populated living below the Tibet Plateau, the China on the east side, and on the south of the Tibetan Plateau, there's the Indian subcontinent, which is streaming with the billions. If you calculate all these things, there must be a certain reason, I was thinking, Otherwise, like you go to the Middle East, you don't find such a population density. So the Tibet sort of the region plays a very important, and it is source of, we know it is source of a lot of water, the river basin system, and that has sort of sustained two very important civilizations of the Asia, the Indian civilization and the Chinese. So it is not without any reason that this civilization has thrived in this area for millions of years. So it is important that I think we must know exactly what is happening in Tibet and what is whether this climate change has what is going to happen to the surrounding region, which is sustained by the water in the rivers of the Tibet. So today we have two very eminent speakers, Dr. Martin and Mr. Gabriel, who is an author. So they will really educate us, and we hope we will do something. We can learn a lot of from this two speaker, and we will have a lively discussion, and then we can share it further so that I think those who are really stakeholder of the Tibet's climate change will listen, and we will listen to this sort of a very, very objective, scientific, academic analysis, understanding of the Tibet's global change. Arta, with these few words, thank you so much. I will leave it here.
Thank you so much, Ngodup. It's always a pleasure to listen to your opening remarks. Sometimes the remarks are provoking. I'm always, having that fear that I don't want you to dive into what the presenters have prepared for us today. But I must also say, colleagues, that we are live streaming at different multiple Tibettv platforms on social media, and we also have participants who are participating from those different platforms outside us who are in this room. Without much ado, Dr. Martins, please, your presentation. I must just highlight that Dr. Martins is the director of Scottish Center for Himalayan Research. He will unpack that for us. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin.
Atta, thank you very much. Yeah, yes, just a few words of introduction to who I am. If we could put the slides up, that would be great. I'm Dr. Martin Mills. I'm the director of the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Just to give you a kind of context to this, I'm a working anthropologist. I would say I'm not a climate scientist, and that's important to say. This is not my kind of working profession for all of my life. Actually, for all of my life, I've been a Tibet specialist. And I've focused on Tibet and the Himalayas in a wide variety of capacities. And one of the ways in which I've always believed I could kind of help out here is to work with parliaments, to provide them with briefings, to provide them with scientific research that universities can provide for, in this case, the Scottish Parliament and sometimes the UK Parliament, just to give them a kind of real kind of bit of scientific background to policy making. As I say, I tend to work with parliaments rather than governments as such. That's a distinction I like to make. A key part of that since about 2007 has been working with the cross-party group on Tibet in the Scottish Parliament. And for most of that time, I've been their briefings officer. And for the last few years up until 2021, I was the secretary of the cross-party group, the parliamentary secretary. And as part of that work, we carried out one of the things that became increasingly clear as the years went by, as briefing papers went by, as issues went by, particularly with reference to population relocations, was that understanding the climate change situation on the Tibetan Plateau and the surrounding regions was absolutely vital to almost all policy discussions that centered on the Tibetan Plateau, but also actually that looked at Asia as a whole. In 2019, we agreed to carry out a climate change inquiry. We called on resources and scientific papers and scientific expertise from across the world for 2 straight years. I personally sat down and read 900 scientific publications just to kind of help with this work. We went and we were as open as we could be as far as that was concerned. The Environment Desk in Dharamsala, NASA, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, wherever we could find reliable data and reliable scientific research, we went to them. And our purpose was to create a kind of consensus, to look at the consensus amongst the scientific establishments of the world as to what the situation was on the Tibetan Plateau. So what you're getting now is a kind of version of that. You can see on the slide, that was the report that we produced, Climate Change on the Third Pole, Causes, Processes and Consequences. If you look at that on the web, you'll find it. But let me just kind of summarize really the first part of that, which is the substance of the Tibetan Plateau's place within Asia as a whole. Can I go to the next slide, please? Okay, this is the Tibetan Plateau, as Ngodup has commented. It's much larger than most people think. A lot of people think it's about the size of Moldova or something on those lines. Actually, the Tibetan Plateau is, roughly speaking, the size of Western Europe. It sits in the heart of Asia. It was forced upwards in a massive sort of geological event about 52 million years ago when India hit Eurasia and created a huge buckle zone, which is the Tibetan Plateau and the surrounding, what we now refer to as the third pole. That third pole is really the sort of mountains at the heart of Asia that have been driven up. Most of them are above 4,000 meters, and they act as kind of the centerpiece of the Central Asian ecosphere. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, just to give you a sense of this and why the Tibetan Plateau and the third pole are really, really important. I'm going to explain this in terms of this slightly complicated slide. This slide is produced by ICIMOD, the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development in Nepal, who are key workers on this area. And what this lists is the rivers that flow off the Tibetan Plateau, that flow off the third pole region and feed Asia. It's a simple fact of life, unfortunately, that all human civilization has to basically live near a river. It has to live near a fresh water supply that will ensure its population can drink, because they can't drink salt water, so they have to drink fresh water. It will provide for their agriculture. You can't grow very much on saltwater fields, and it provides for manufacturing. You can't put salt water into an engine, it'll break it. So the fresh water supply is these rivers that come off the Tibetan Plateau. Now, at the heart of Asia, we have this yellow area here, which is generally speaking what many people will refer to as the third pole. It's called the third pole because it contains a huge quantity of frozen fresh water. After the two other poles, the Arctic and the Antarctic, this is the largest supply of frozen fresh water on Earth. And it's often called the third pole, but it's important to understand that it is the only pole with half the world's population sitting on its doorstep dependent upon it. We don't actually get fresh water from the Arctic or the Antarctic because they're simply too far away, or they're sitting in the middle of an ocean. So this is the one that really, really supplies almost half the human race in terms of manufacturing and agriculture and things on those lines. Now, at the heart of that, if I can have the next click on, at the heart of that is the Tibetan Plateau. Okay, the Tibetan Plateau is ringed by mountain ranges: the Himalaya, the Karakoram, the Kunlun Mountains to the north, the Nyenchen Mountains to the east. And all of these mountain ranges sort of sit around the Tibetan Plateau like a kind of large goblet, as it were. And off the Tibetan Plateau, these major rivers flow: the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, the Mekong, the Irrawaddy, the Salween, the Brahmaputra, the Amu Darya, the Indus, all of these rivers that depend upon that uplift and that cold effect to provide fresh water for Asia as a whole. Okay, can I move on to the next slide, please? Now that that freshwater frozen supply, that third pole, the word we often use is cryosphere. It's a domain of ice, as it were. In many respects, it actually corresponds directly to the Sanskrit word Himalaya, which also means abode of ice, or the word that Tibetans anciently used for the whole Tibetan area, which is Kawachen, the holder of ice. And the ice exists there really in three major regards: glaciers, permafrost, and snow. Okay, glaciers, you know. Permafrost is an area that most people are a little bit more unfamiliar with, particularly in the African context. There's not much permafrost running around. Permafrost is deep underground supplies of ice, and when they have existed for a very long time, that ice really exists almost effectively as an underground iceberg or glacier that sits underneath the ground, and often you have to dig about 1 or 2 meters down, and you will simply come across an ice shield that is underneath that. Now, many areas, particularly on the northern hemisphere, that ice can be very, very deep. If we go to, for example, Siberia, the permafrost depth of that iceberg, as it were, can reach as much as 1.5 kilometers deep. If we go to Canada, for example, 760 odd meters is the deepest we've found. Excuse me. Just going to have a quick cough. On the Tibetan Plateau, actually, we don't know as much as we'd like as far as this is concerned, and there is a definite call for more scientific research. But we do know that this combined cryosphere acts as the center of Asia's weather systems because of the cold and the height. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, next slide again. Right. Now, the problem here is that cryosphere is melting. As you can see here from this diagram, the average air temperature around the Tibetan Plateau and around the Third Pole region has gradually increased over the last century. A vital aspect of that is 0 degrees centigrade. This is what is often referred to as a tipping point, in the simple fact that 0 degrees centigrade is the point at which ice turns to water. All right, we all know that that's that temperature, and that occurred actually really quite a while ago. That occurred during the 1980s. That shift of the overall average mean temperature of the Tibetan Plateau shifted above 0 degrees centigrade, and as a consequence, across the board, we see increased melting. Okay, and that melting, all that is required at this point in time is, for it to continue, is time. It's a little like you put the ice cube out in the sun. The temperature doesn't actually have to get any higher for it to just continue melting. As long as it's above 0 degrees centigrade, that is what's going to happen. And that is what's happening to the Tibetan Plateau as a whole. The Tibetan Plateau is simply melting, and ice is shifting into water, whether it's snow, whether it's permafrost, or whether it's glaciers. All of those have moved since the 1980s into a tendency towards melting. And that is shifting dramatically the water structure of Asia as a whole. And that has been going on now for 40 years. So it's a deep process. It's already in train. We're already there. This isn't some discussion about the future. This is actually the last 40 years. And anybody that's been to Tibet over the last 40 years, somewhere like Lhasa, for example, will be aware. I've been going there since 1986, for example, and it's very obvious how much the temperature has changed. Now, the drivers of that change are threefold, and I can't go into great depth now because of time, but there are really three kinds of drivers. There are local drivers. So, for example, mining practices, urbanization, transport infrastructure, all of that creates local heat. And that will affect local areas. So if a glacier is close, for example, to a city, it's going to start melting more. The second driver for that is pollution. Effectively speaking, if you get brown and black carbon pollution that comes onto the Tibetan Plateau and it lands on a glacier, it's like putting a dark coat on a warm day. You're going to get hot. And the glacier is going to start, and glaciers and snow and permafrost is going to start melting more. I would hasten to add here, as far as that's concerned, most of the pollution that lies across the Tibetan Plateau that is landing on the Tibetan Plateau is driven by winds that come from the west. Okay, so they drive, effectively speaking, across Pakistan onto the Tibetan Plateau and from there onto the Chinese mainland. And that driver pulls pollution, particularly from areas like the northern Gangetic Plain in India, onto the Himalayas and onto this particularly southern Tibet. So that's a significant driver. The next one is simple global warming. It is the increase in carbon dioxide levels that is causing the sun's rays to be trapped within Earth's troposphere. Earth's troposphere, in case you didn't know, is between 15 and 7 and 15 miles high, depending on where you are. It's not very high. Most adults could walk that in a day. And the carbon dioxide that is trapped there effectively allows the sun's rays to be trapped in that troposphere and to warm it. So the thing that's really driving this global warming, as far as that's concerned, is it's not heat from the human race. It's actually heat from the sun, and that's an awful lot more powerful. Now, out of those three drivers, it is undoubtedly global warming driven by anthropogenic CO2 change that is causing the overall heating pattern. So in this regard, the heating of the Tibetan Plateau, the melting of the Tibetan Plateau, is driven by international effects that come from all around the world. The CO2 mixes and is driven around the world by wind patterns and everything on those lines. So this is CO2 that is produced in Europe. This is CO2 that is produced in America. This is CO2 that's produced in China. This is CO2 that's produced in India or Australia. All of that at some point or other affects the Tibetan Plateau. Can I have the next slide? Now, one of the things that you'll be familiar with is the story of the melting glaciers on the Tibetan Plateau and across the Third Pole region itself. This was something that, there is a definitive pattern, with the possible single exception of the Western Karakoram region. It's often called the Karakoram anomaly. That Karakoram anomaly is a situation where, because of the combination of winds and heavy rockfall on top of glaciers, most of those glaciers are actually staying put, although there's some evidence that they are shifting towards melting now. But for the last 40 years, they have managed to remain stable. However, that is only a tiny portion of the Third Pole region as a whole, across which, in general, the glaciers are melting across the way, and this is producing significant water effects. And we look to actually the ending of most of the Third Pole's glaciers by the end of this century. So more than 50 to 60% of them will be gone by the end of this century. And those are particularly for areas like the Punjab, for Xinjiang, for areas like Pakistan. These are really significant water sources. So their loss has a huge impact on the human race around the Third Pole region. Can I have the next slide, please? Move forward one. There we go. The second thing that is changing is simply with the air temperature changes, the permafrost underneath the ground. And again, another considerable source of fresh water when it melts during the summer season is that permafrost is also decaying at a considerable rate and is breaking up. This has a dramatic effect actually on the Tibetan Plateau itself, and particularly local grasslands and things on those lines, because permafrost actually acts to support the water supply by holding it up. In case it isn't obvious, ice is waterproof, and therefore this underground shield acts when it is there to keep water close to the surface, so within a kind of meter or two of the surface. You can have grasslands, you can grow barley, you can do many of those things. But and if we move forward on the slide, as you can see, when that shift of warming occurs, what we see is a gradual breaking up of that permafrost, a melting of it. It's moving away from the surface. That water table is dropping, and that is creating significant effects across the Tibetan Plateau, which I will come to right now. The most substantial there, if we move to the next slide. Keep going one, because I'm running out of time. The most substantial effect there is on the way in which water moves across the plateau. We've heard that glaciers are melting, and normally that would provide us with more water. But that's not the case if the permafrost underneath the ground is breaking up and there are holes developing on it. And very simply, the water just falls down those holes into the area underneath the permafrost. Okay, so your water table begins to drop dramatically, and particularly around river headlands, the amount of water that comes to those major river headlands begins to reduce. Why? Because the land itself progressively desertifies. Can I have the next slide, please? So it moves from that to something more like this, and eventually, next slide again, please. And eventually turns into something like this. And this is one of the effects that we've seen from global warming across the Tibetan Plateau, which is a dramatic flash creation of desertification across a whole range of areas. And particularly the People's Republic of China have had to sort of seek to respond to this protest, and they've found it, you know, a terrifying prospect that particularly around river headlands, you see this desertification process, which is affecting the amount of water that's actually coming off those plateaus, because that water is going deep into the Tibetan Plateau. Tibetan Plateau, we know from NASA numbers, for example, is actually increasing in water weight by about 7 to 9 gigatons a year. But at the same time, that water is going very, very deep, so it's not available at the surface for rivers and crops and grasslands. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, what effect does that have on Asia as a whole? Well, this is very simple. This should be, I hope you got this in secondary school. There's such a thing as a water cycle. If the Tibetan Plateau warms up as a whole, we are faced with very significant water availability problems for Asia as a whole. And we are seeing this already in train at the moment. Water during the summer months tends to evaporate from the seas. That leaves behind the salt. It's transported by air pressure towards a cold mountain environment. The hot moves towards the cold. It then falls there because it's colder as precipitation, as snow or rain or sleet, and it lands on a cold environment. That's where we were 40 years ago. It lands on a cold environment and creates glaciers and creates snow, helps to generate permafrost and all of those kinds of things. And what generally then happens is, if we go to the next slide, if you have that ice supply, during the summer months, during the drier seasons when there is less rain, that ice that is up in the high mountains trickles off. It gradually melts and supports those rivers. It supports the Indus, it supports the Irrawaddy, it supports the Yangtze and the Yellow. And that makes certain that those rivers exist all year round, okay? Now, one of the things we're seeing from the warming effect of the Tibetan Plateau is that water cycle is being dramatically affected, okay? Because there really, really is less ice to keep that water up in the mountains so that it can be provided year round. And what we're seeing, if we move on to the last slide, what we're seeing, therefore, is that these rivers and the sort of bluish river basins around them, we're seeing an increasing compromise and fluctuations in the river's capacity to support cities, to support agriculture, to support manufacturing, to support, really, basically speaking, human civilization around those areas. Some rivers in particular, such as what we're seeing now is in particular rivers like the Tarim, the Amu Darya, and the Indus, all to the west of the Tibetan Plateau. Those are rivers which are strongly dependent simply on glacial meltwater. And those are the rivers, particularly that groups like, for example, Penn State University, who have been running the numbers on this one, those are the ones which are threatened most immediately now, and really actually get to a situation where you will have months of the year where there is simply no water coming off them, because the Tibetan Plateau in its warming function is increasingly becoming like a sponge, and it's holding that water in. On the eastern side, so really pointing towards areas like Southeast Asia and towards the People's Republic, towards China, the Chinese mainland, rivers such as the Yangtze and the Yellow are increasingly destabilizing. So you may have noticed, for example, this summer, particularly with the heat wave that occurred in Sichuan, the Yangtze simply ran dry for months. And under those circumstances, well, you know, you can't actually run a factory, you can't have electricity, you can't have agriculture, you can't have all of these things. So there are very, very significant threats, particularly to places like Pakistan, to China's capacity to feed itself, to North India's capacity to feed itself with wheat. All of these are being affected. Areas such as Xinjiang, for example, you know, really they are going to run out of water within 10 or 20 years. And when that happens, we're going to see very dramatic movement of populations. Tibetan Plateau as a whole, in about 100 years, actually becomes more fertile, but the areas around it, they are very significantly compromised in their capacity to hold human communities. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. That's a very insightful presentation. I'm sure we might not be seeing a lot of comments coming because a lot of us are not actually into climate change research, but notwithstanding, we are benefiting a lot. Gabriel, are you ready to take us through? Please, yep. The floor is yours.
Okay, I'm Gabriel Laffite. I've been an environmental activist for over 50 years, working especially from my home, which is in Australia, on mining and resource issues. His Holiness the Dalai Lama really turned my mind, to use a classic Tibetan phrase, in the mid-1970s, which is by now 45 years ago. So in my research and publishing as an author and writing mostly on a blog, I focus very much on environmental issues, the whole spectrum of environmental issues in Tibet. So I would like to broaden the discussion now and share with you, precisely because Martin Mills has given us such a wonderful and depth of understanding of the situation in Tibet. So what I'd like to do is to see if we can contextualize this in the, first of all, think a little about where Africa comes in to this story, and particularly what's happening right at the moment in Sharm el-Sheikh, in Egypt, in the Egyptian desert, and by the way, in a latitude that is about as far from the equator as is Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. People think that Tibet, because it's cold, you know, is you know, the third pole, that it's somehow sort of very, very far from the tropics, but actually it's not. Cairo and Durban are roughly about the same distance from the equator as Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. So Tibet is cold because it's high and not because it's at one of the poles. So what is the connection? What can we say about, no, sorry, there we go. Okay, so here's the latest headlines. Here is something in a world that we now live in where everything is happening so fast, so confusing, so confronting, that there are things that are going on right now that might surprise us precisely because they are issues on which key players are actually being rather scarily quiet and not speaking up. So I'm going to focus partly on China's role in the world on climate issues, and particularly on the question of climate justice, climate compensation, the current debate, which is one of the major aspects of the COP27 going on in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt at the moment. And this is a particular concern of African countries who very reasonably, along with, Pakistan, Bangladesh, many other countries in Asia as well, say we are the ones who experience climate change and the harmful effects of climate change most dramatically. And yet the rich countries don't provide finance. They don't acknowledge, except in rather sort of vague terms, a moral, political and legal responsibility for compensation, specifically for the loss and damage. That's the key phrase that's being debated in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh at the moment. So what is China's role? I come from, a rich Western country, Australia, likewise Martin. These are the countries that historically have emitted a lot of carbon and are at least on paper now saying that, yes, they do acknowledge a responsibility to finance climate adaptation in those countries that did very little to emit the greenhouse gases that cause the climate problems. But there is one country that is the biggest polluter, the biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the world, and that is China. So I'm now focusing on China's role. And China, amazingly, I think it's amazing, is saying, on the one hand, they think it is absolutely essential that countries of the global south, which includes nearly all of Africa and much of Asia and South America, do deserve climate compensation. And they're quite passionate that this is the responsibility of the rich countries. But China is not going to provide any money itself. How is that possible when China is the world's biggest polluter? Likewise, China and India have not sent their top leaders to the climate discussion, and you probably, if you've been following the news, seen them popping up instead in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, and then in Bali, and in a day or two in Thailand for political meetings. And it's one of the, speaking as an environmentalist, it's one of the sad aspects of and ironic aspects of the pandemic that started in Wuhan, in China, precisely because the human presence has been pushing further and further into the habitats of wildlife, and the inevitable happened, which a lot of people knew was, bound to happen sometime soon, where a virus jumps from an animal into the lungs of humans, and the entire world has had to live with this pandemic for the last 2 or 3 years now. And one of the consequences of this global pandemic is that all of the United Nations treaties and conventions that are intended, set up to save nature, save wildlife, save the climate, save the planet that we live on, and to deal with all of the issues that Martin Mills has taken us through. And those conferences, COPs, conferences of the parties, to use United Nations jargon, got delayed and delayed and delayed because of the pandemic. And that's why they're all being held now in a great rush. 3 big conferences, one immediately after another. Last week we had the conference of the parties on the global wetlands, the Ramsar Convention, which are incredibly important in Tibet. We are in the middle of the climate COP, and in a week or two we'll be having the Convention on Biodiversity COP, competing with the FIFA World Cup for attention. So there may be things going on quietly behind the scenes that are really important for us to know, and that nobody talks about. China is the cheerleader of demands that rich nations pay loss and damage compensation to the global south. Yet the reality is that China burns more of the coal that causes the greenhouse gas emissions than the rest of the world put together. That's scary. And it's even more scary because China has no intention of reducing its emissions until 2030 at the earliest. And yet the scientists keep saying that it is in this decade, the 2020s, that the world has its last chance to reduce emissions and stay within a total climate temperature rise of 1.5 degrees. And the reason why people keep talking about 1.5 degrees as, you know, the really important threshold is that the scientists are telling us that once the temperature rises above 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, then it spirals out of control, and then nobody can control it. And we're in a spiral where really, really sort of drastic events will be happening all over Africa, as we have just saw in Asia in the last few months, with extraordinary floods in Pakistan and drought as Martin Mills mentioned, in the whole of Eastern China. It's this decade. That's the crucial decade. And yet China is rapidly adding more and more coal-fired power stations while saying it is a champion of leading the third world, leading a club of developing countries, providing an exemplary ecological civilization, which is a key phrase that the Chinese are using. But if you look at the actual emissions, you can see in the middle of this graph, that sort of pale pinky purple color, which is China. China's emissions, and this graph takes you through to 2030, China's emissions just keep on growing and growing. So much so that the further emissions that China has said it will continue to pour out into the air that we all breathe, as if the air is just a sink, an inexhaustible, common, full resource that is free and has no consequences. China alone could undo what the rest of the world is struggling and trying and at least partially succeeding in doing, which is to actually start reducing emissions. And this is a great puzzle because China presents itself as a world leader. And this is where Tibet comes in. China uses the Tibetan plateau, which, as Martin Mills reminded us, is the size of the whole of Western Europe, say from Spain to Sweden, or Greece to Scotland, as the solution to China's problems. China wants and needs more and more electricity, wants to continue to be the world's factory, to dominate global manufacturing and continue to generate and concentrate wealth. And yet, so how does it become at the same time an ecological civilization? By designating huge parts of Tibet to be national parks. Now, that might sound like a good idea, but it involves excluding the locals. This picture shows you just a small part of the water meadows of eastern Tibet. This is the Dzogye wetland, which is where the Chinese provinces of Qinghai, Sichuan, and Gansu all meet. And the Tibetan people in the foreground have been able skillfully to make a living in what Europeans would call a swamp, and in which the Chinese decided also water and land are so mixed that they had to be separated. So they did what Europeans have always done to separate land and water, which is to dig drainage ditches. And only now, 30, 40, 50 years later, realizing that this was a great mistake, and they've been filling in the ditches and the water is returning. But if you declare this a national park, that might be good, but what China does is to then exclude the locals. They say that they're establishing national parks to protect wildlife, but the reality is that the areas that on the Tibetan plateau that China is redlining, drawing, really sort of rigid, bureaucratically determined boundaries around, are not the areas of greatest biodiversity. Instead, they're in the areas that matter to China, because those, as Martin Mills has showed us so well on his maps, these are the upper sections of China's great rivers, the Yellow and the Yangtze. Those are the areas that China is declaring to be national parks. Those are the areas that matter most to China and lead China to call Tibet China's #1 water tower. China can import all sorts of raw materials from Africa, from Latin America, but it can't import water for two reasons. One is that water is really heavy and the boats would sink in the ocean. But then the second one is there's simply such a vast amount of water needed by China's agriculture, by China's cities, by China's industries, that there's just no way that this could be done. So Tibet becomes the solution to so many of China's problems, and that means the eviction, the enclosure, the displacement of the nomads who have skillfully managed these wetlands, these pastures, these rivers, these landscapes sustainably for thousands of years without any suggestion that they were overgrazing or unaware of the consequences of their actions. And yet China says that there is a contradiction between grass and animals, which is an extraordinarily simplistic Marxist dialectic, which is basically asserting that the more animals graze, the less grass you have, or conversely, the fewer animals, the more grass grows. You know, that would mean that all of the pastoralists of all of the dry lands of Africa are illegitimate, vandals, destructive, and as in Tibet, should immediately be evicted. That's nonsense. Nomads know how to live off uncertainty in the dry lands where nobody else understands the dynamics, and certainly China doesn't. China is now no longer interested in financing a lot of major development projects in Africa, nor is it interested in financing the climate adaptation, loss and compensation, loss and damage compensation payments. China, according to a lot of the experts these days, is really interested only in political alliances. Its focus has narrowed. China is experiencing so many difficulties of its own. It's no longer interested in the long term. It's interested only in gathering political allies. And one of the most dramatic examples, which again includes many African countries, is if you look at the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which has 57 members, not one of which was willing to speak up for their fellow Muslims, the Uyghurs, the immediate neighbors of the Tibetans, just to the north of Tibet. In Martin Mills's map, he showed the Tarim River. That's part of Xinjiang, the homeland of the Uyghurs. China has narrowed its focus to being a political bully, throwing its weight around politically, while at the same time just quietly, not with any much publicity, dropping any suggestion of getting involved and accepting responsibility for compensating Africa for loss and damage. Again, this is a headline. If you look at the date, November the 9th, so it's from only a few days ago. And again, this is from the same source as one of our first slides, the China Global South website, which is a website generated by people who generally are very positive towards China, but they too are facing the reality that China deals direct with Africa's elites, bypassing citizens, local communities, the people who are directly impacted by climate change. That's increasingly sad, because if China is doing deals and financing the political elites of Africa, those elites are no longer answerable to their own citizens because of the political and financial support that they are getting from China. And, that's starting to get to be a really serious issue. So China on climate is really trying to have it both ways. China avoids any liability to compensate the global south for loss and damage due to the droughts, the floods, and the extreme weather caused by climate heating, which so many African countries are experiencing, as well as Asian countries. China somehow manages to maintain its position as the world's factory, as the most complete commodity value chain the world has ever seen, and it's something China is very proud of and determined to persist with, while maintaining very fast urbanization and an ever deepening or expanding ecological footprint, and yet it's a champion of the global south. Somehow it just doesn't add up, and these are things that are not being spoken of. China has basically lost interest in the environment. So that's a summary of a much more comprehensive argument that I have just published on my website. The vlog post on this particular issue is called Coughing In, Coughing Out, and the link is on the bottom of this slide. So I'll leave it there and we can open up for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. It's always heart-touching to listen to your presentation. Colleague, as a reminder, the presentations will always be available on various social media spaces. And if you need a hard copy of a soft copy of the presentation, rather, you can always write to me and I will get it from our presenters. Before we open up for Q&A from our participant, allow me just to take a few minutes to probe the two presentations, and also we will then allow our two speakers to respond to my probing. Then we can open up to our various participants. Dr. Martin, I start with you. You talked about, in passing, Tibetan plateau need more scientific research. I would just want to find out how accessible is the plateau for outside academic and researchers, in your own opinion. And also you mentioned about the three drivers of climate change in that part of the world, which you talked about: local, which is mining practices and urbanization. You also mentioned about pollution, brown and black carbon pollution, and global warming. I'm just taking pollution. From your position, are there policies related to the issue of pollution that are there to probably protect local Tibetan communities around the plateau? And also, if there are any countermeasures for future water shortages, in your opinion, because I mean, the issues of climate change, including the question of water shortages, is obvious, and I'm sure we will probably need to understand what are the preparations that are being taken place in relation to that. I'm not sure if I should probe Gabriel because I don't see him on his seat, but let's just get to you, Dr. Martin. When he comes back, then I'll be able to probe him to his hearing, please.
Okay,
The floor
sure.
is yours.
I mean, when it comes to the pollution side of things, yes, there is much that can be done. As I mentioned, air pollution in particular affects the Tibetan plateau from a variety of directions. It affects it from the south, coming off the Gangetic Plain of India. It also affects it from the northeast. We know the direction of these things because they are actually tested through carbon-14 calculations as to where they came from. If one looks at those questions of pollution, I mean, Both China and India are struggling hard with their pollution problems. And those come from a variety of, it's not just manufacturing that generates that. We're also talking about the particular organization, for example, of stubble burning, for example, on agricultural fields, how you work the time scale of those in comparison with the way the winds, for example, move across the across regions like the plateau. And these are actually problems, I mean, all of the problems that we looked at here, they are most extreme perhaps on the Tibetan plateau, without a shadow of doubt. But many of the problems that we're looking at here apply also to Africa with regards to its water supplies. It applies, for example, the same patterns apply in California, for example. And the water issues that are emerging all across the world are occurring there. And I would hasten to add, they are occurring significantly in first world countries, second world and third world countries. It really, climate change doesn't care how rich you are. All that being rich does is it allows you to move out the way easier. But really, climate change doesn't substantially impact the geographical areas. So, for example, one of the things we've noticed quite recently is that climate change is actually speeding up twice as fast in Europe as it is across the world. One of the major challenges that we have to face here is how to handle water, and in particular, how to handle water occurring and falling in very short, dramatic bursts of rain. We get this in the UK right now, actually, but we're also getting it across the Himalayas. You get it in a wide variety of places, and then holding that water and ensuring that it is available for the rest of the year when there will be less rain. And that's a problem that Africa is going to face. That is a problem that Asia faces. That is a problem that Europe faces. And that is a problem that America is going to face. And one of those is, I mean, one of the big answers there, the Chinese, for example, have experimented extensively with damming as far as that's concerned as a manner of holding back. It hasn't proven, it's too monolithic an answer. The truth of the matter is, in most of these cases, what we need to do, rather than coming up with a single great answer by which we will all be free, this doesn't tend to work. We need to replace ecologies with ecologies. We need to replace, dams are, yes, they're useful, but if there are too many of them and they're too big, the impact becomes dramatic all of its own. One of the things, for example, that we're working on in the upper Himalayas is artificial glaciers, forestation of regions, the reintroduction of keystone species, for example, to help with the rebuilding of ecologies. That requires an awful lot of intellectual work from soil scientists, from species specialists, from climatologists. All of this kind of work requires a huge quantity of actual thought beyond that idea that which has been very popular recently. If only we all move to solar power, it will sort us out. If only we all move to hydroelectric, it will sort us out. One answer will never do the job. We need to work harder at reproducing the ecologies that we have destroyed over the last century. And those have to be ecologies that we work on ourselves. So
thank you so much.
Really kind of.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. Actually, because of time, I will have held you for more on ecologies to replace ecologies. That's an interesting comment that needs more unpacking. However, Gabriel, I didn't want to probe you in your absence because I saw you made a bit of displacement there. What I would just want you to highlight, Gabriel, is yes, you've spoken to us a lot with insightful fact on China's role on climate issue, climate change justice and climate change compensation. My question to you, Gabriel, is there any politics in climate change compensation, or in other words, is climate change compensation politics on its own? I mean, taking into account the fact that China is pushing for climate change compensation to the global south, at the same time, it is the main the highest producer is at the same time the highest. China burns more and more carbon than every other part of the world. My question is, what is in the mind of China in the midst of such controversial or opposing attitude, not wanting to pay climate change compensation, but pushing forward at the same time for climate change compensation, and also at the same time emitting more, carbon. That is, yeah, please, let us get your take.
Yeah, an excellent question, Atabongwoung. I guess we could plunge into numbers, but the numbers involved in compensation are so enormous, they're very hard to imagine. And if the world is serious about dealing with climate change, China also needs to decarbonize its own economy. And the best experts in the world say that it might require an investment of as much as 14 trillion, that's million, 14 trillion US dollars just within China in order to decarbonize. So whether China has the will or the energy or the money to do that, even just within China, let alone paying compensation to countries that are suffering the consequences of China's emissions, are we serious? Are we actually serious enough? But I think the key really, rather than obsessing about the numbers involved in compensation, loss and damage, is to look at the one key phrase, one slogan, one little piece of jargon that China uses in order to say two things at once. On the one hand, yes, the Global South is suffering. Yes, the Global South does deserve compensation. But at the same time, China has no responsibility to pay it. And that is a key phrase that China has inserted into all sorts of United Nations documents because their diplomats have argued for it for a long time. And it sounds perfectly innocent. The phrase is common but differentiated responsibilities. And it's a phrase that China has used over and over and over for the last 20, 30 years as a way of, and they use exactly the same phrase, when talking about human rights, that it's only the West that tries to talk about universal human rights, universal obligations, that all humans are born with inborn human rights. China rejects that. Common but differentiated. Yet, so China is saying, yes, all countries, all states, all governments have a responsibility to behave responsibly when it comes to climate, but we have differentiated responsibilities, and the responsibility for doing something effective on climate, which includes compensation for loss and damage, is solely the responsibility of the richest countries. Countries like Scotland, like Australia, like Europe, like the United States. And they are slowly, inadequately starting to face up to that reality. But does that exempt China, the world's biggest polluter? If China is exempt because it has differentiated responsibilities, then I don't think we're going to succeed in saving the planet, to put it simply.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. Time is an issue with us here. However, as food for thought, my second problem would have been, since you mentioned that China uses Tibet to solve its problems, I had wanted to ask what then is the future of Tibet from your perspective. However, I'm going to open up to our participants. Colleague, if you have a question, you just click on the icon to raise your hand, and we're going to open up for you to ask your question. If you don't have a question, I'll just give a few seconds if you don't have a question. There's actually a serious conversation between Dr. Martins engaging our colleague Nikki. If you are on the chat, you'll be able to see how insightful the conversation is. Dr. Martin has been answering some of, you know, the probing of Nikki as well. Colleagues, if you have a question, you can raise your hand. If there are no questions, we will just allow one minute to our presenters to give their final thoughts, probably their position, and then our friend Ngodup will give us a closing remark. Our webinars are always for 1 hour. We do it because we consider time change and differences in all different parts of the world. Please, I see there are no questions. Dr. Martin, your closing. Okay, Nick, yes, please, unmute yourself.
Yeah, I have. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Perfect.
No, I was just saying, I was just thinking in a way that if these rivers stop running eventually in the time that follows, the Indians and the Chinese, you say that there'll be no more civilization. If there's no more rivers, no more water coming from Tibet, where are these populations going to go to? Where are they going to move to the West? Are they going to go to Europe? Like in a small way, the Syrians left Syria because it's dry and there's no more food, no more. Will this be a tendency that they will leave those regions and move west?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because it also brings the issue of dynamic and climate change. The dynamics of migration and climate change also touch on that. Yes. Nikki is asking an interesting question, Dr. Martin and Gabriel, probably just a projection in future. What do you think will happen?
Well, we're already seeing significant climate change driven population migration already. We're for example, the collapse of fishing stocks off the West African coast is causing people to move, and many of them are moving north, for example, across the Mediterranean to Europe, and we will soon certainly have significant drivers from areas such as Pakistan. But what we're already seeing in many of these cases, we're actually seeing invisible population movements, because as your land gradually dries out, you send your kids to school somewhere else, and that is a climate migration. And we don't register it as such. It comes under economic migration or something on those lines. I mean, this is one of the areas where we're already seeing things that the question is how you label them. But the answer to your question is, yes, we're talking about very, very significant population movements, but this occurs across generations, and that is, people dying younger, the next generation moves slightly, all of those kinds of things. In certain cases, with reference to massive flooding events, that causes such as we've seen in Pakistan, for example, that really has short-term effects across, only a few years.
Interesting comment there, Dr. Martin. I think what we will do, we will expand this webinar for next year by the grace of God to look into climate change and migration issue in the context also to find out if it applies the same with the Tibetans that are in Tibet. Because yes, migration is a global issue, but then looking at the constraint in terms of what happens in that part of the world will be an interesting dynamic. Gabriel, do you have a thought on Nikki's probing?
Yes, look, just briefly, the scenario that Nikki, the very alarming scenario that Nikki raises, is certainly a real possibility. Let's say towards the end of this century, the way things seem to be going. Before then, in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years perhaps, we have actually, so far as China is concerned, and a lot of Chinese scientists and the Chinese Meteorological Administration are all saying this, there is an increased stream flow from eastern Tibet into China, and they see that as a dividend. And the Chinese scientists are pumping out maps that show more and more of Tibet is becoming farmable, a stronger vegetation growth. In other words, Tibet is becoming more like China and therefore more suitable for settler colonialism. You know, one of China's great anxieties is that they've never managed to colonize Tibet because of the climate. It's just not suitable for traditional Chinese agriculture. And this, I think, is one of the reasons why China is just quietly dropping its focus on climate and on environmental issues generally, not only because it's got lots of short-term challenges, and the Chinese government at the moment is just as focused on the short term as any Western government is, even though they say that they're long-term thinkers. But another reason why China is dropping any serious effort on climate is that it's paying off for them in the short term. Once the glaciers are gone, once the dynamics that Martin has been describing, you know, really kick in, including, you know, the water in the upper stretches of the rivers just disappearing underground and the rivers drying up, which is not so much in eastern Tibet at the moment, but it may well happen. Then, you know, 50, 60, 70 years from now, towards the end of this century, the situation will be very dire.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. Let's just bring Tulani. That will be the end for the day. Tulani, my brother, bring your wisdom here. I see your hand up. Tulani, are you there? Yeah, go ahead. Unmute yourself, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the beautiful webinar that has been organized. That is eye-opening. As we all know, that one of the goals of His Holiness Dalai Lama is to take care of the environment. So it is very beautiful that Tibet is taking the lead to look at the impact of climate change. And we also bring it to Africa. As we are in Africa, also we do face a lot of climate change problem. Like, for example, we face the coal mining crisis that is happening at Emalahleni municipality in Witbank. For more than 50 years, the mining of coal has been happening and nothing has been happening to reverse the impact of climate change. So these people who are polluting the space, they should be held responsible. So we will work with the Office of Tibet, South Africa, to make sure that we start the programs also here in South Africa to reverse the impact of climate change. His Holiness Dalai Lama, he always emphasize about we must take care of nature, because of nature is the only thing that we have that will give us everything that we need. So thank you for the presentation from Dr. Gabriel and also from the other speaker. It was very informative to learn about the land of Tibet. I wish one day I could travel to Tibet and get to witness what they are talking about. All blessings to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, my brother Tulani. Ngodup La and the monk Lobsang Donju, they have noted your desire to travel to Tibet. Desire sometimes is a hard thing for someone like Atta, but we'll talk about that later on. Colleagues, there is no much time. I guess Ngodup should just give us a closing remark. Should, in case there is something that any of our speakers want to say, we can give you a couple of seconds to say that before Ngodup comes in. Is there any comment one of the speakers want to make?
I'd just like to leap in just to back up Gabriel's point. Many very large political players are now shifting from an emphasis on mitigation, that is stopping this process, to adapting to it. And many of them are taking an increasingly lifeboat policy of this. How do we get through this? And many of them are, for example, moving back to fossil fuels to do that. And it's a very, very different political process from the kind of consensus. It's not because they reject the science. They've looked at the science and they're going, how do we survive and what are the opportunities and the resources we need to do that? And that is creating a very different politics.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. I actually enjoy your choice of concept. When you talk about the lifeboat policies, I feel like retaining you guys for a couple of minutes again, but that is not possible in terms of time issue. Ngodup, please give us a closing remark and then we'll be out of here.
Okay, Adia, thank you once again. And today, I think all of us will acknowledge, I think we had a very, very in-depth and very, very enriching conversation on the global climate change and impact on the Tibetan plateau. So important, and I think we had one scientific perspective, what is actually taking place. And from Gabriel, I think we have learned what is happening, what is the Chinese position or what they are trying to do to mitigate or to really manage the climate change effect on Tibet, as well as throughout globally, So this is very interesting. I think we enjoyed. My sort of a question is that, had the Chinese not occupied Tibet 50 years ago, what would have been the sort of a climate change impact on Tibet? Because Tibet has been there. Tibetans has been the custodian of the Tibetan plateau for the millenniums, and their sort of the whole lifestyle approach is sort of an antithesis of the materialistic, the worldview, or you can say that we have now pursuing. So the climate change problem is that we have the whole sort of the material development. So the material economic development that we are talking about, the sin is embedded into that. So we are pursuing it, and at the time we are trying to say how to solve this climate change. So this, in my view, this is a contradictory, because the problem of the climate change is the economic development that we are pursuing day and night. We are chasing after the GDPs and all the time. And this is the problem. And unless we take a look at that, realistically, I think whatever we say about the climate change, the theories and mitigation and adaptation technology, it would be a very, very difficult, So my idea is that Tibet had the Chinese not been there, occupied Tibet, of course, the global climate change, there will be effect, but the exacerbation of the Chinese policy, of the mining, of the damming, of the urbanization, of the infrastructure development, all these effects would not be very much, little less. So, so that's sort of my thing, my understanding, my question that I want to pose here. And Chinese has been always, as Gabriel has said, Gabriel has been hiding under the level of developing country. Developing country has to do something, compensate. The rich country, those who have polluted the environment must compensate for the global south sort of thing, But China, recently, is one of the many. And unless China doesn't do something, very, very difficult. So we must, I think, there must be a strong understanding all over the globe, that China must do something. They can't hide under the level of the emerging developing country. They don't want to be called as a developed country. Actually, they were already developed, So that is one question that we have to think. Thank you so much. I think this is a fantastic conversation that we have. And the next week, actually, I'm going to Durban. Again, there is sort of a talk on the climate change that so a lot of material that I got from this presentation. Thank you, Ada, so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Martins. Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you, colleagues, for participating. It's been very, very insightful. We will still bring our our speakers next year by the grace of God, because they have so much that we've not tapped into, and we need to tap and take every knowledge that they have such that we could look into the issues that are confronting us here in Africa. It's not haphazard that we had such a brilliant choice of speaker. We can always understand at the end of the day, my only remark would be that we all understand that China is a danger to itself. Let's help China while we free Tibet. Thank you, guys. Have a great day. Have a great moment. Bye-bye.
Okay, Martin, thank you so much. Gabriel and all. Nikki, thank you so much.
Thank you.